Ryo Kanzaki had spent 15 years believing the Kagetsu Kai had paid for the surgery that kept him alive. Then, a charity director he had been ordered to intimidate opened a missing ledger and showed him a payment made on the exact day of his operation. The money had not come from Kagetsu. Worse, someone had later rewritten the transaction to make it look as if it had. 3 days earlier, the ledger had disappeared from a secured financial archive on the 23rd floor of Kagetsu Holdings. It was old-bound in dark leather. It was inconveniently physical in an organization that had spent years moving sensitive accounting into encrypted systems. Masato Shindo wanted it recovered before anyone outside the syndicate understood what it contained. Ryo was called into Shindo's office before sunrise. Shindo placed a single photograph on the desk. A woman stood outside a modest medical foundation in Yokohama, one hand holding a folder against her coat. The image had been taken from across the street, Dr. Amara Vale Shindo said, director of Hoshin House. Ryo studied the photograph. She stole it. She has it. That was not the same answer. Ryo noticed but did not press. Shindo had recruited him when he was 23. The surgery 2 years earlier should have left him buried beneath a hospital debt he could never have repaid. Kagetsu had covered the cost arrange work and eventually given him something more useful than gratitude position. Ryo had spent 15 years making himself worth the investment. What does she know? He asked. Probably less than she thinks. Shindo slid a thin folder across the desk. Hoshin House operated a medical assistance program for migrants, contract laborers, and families who could not survive conventional private care. It was underfunded, overextended, and dependent on outside vendors who could be influenced. Ryo understood the instruction. Recover the ledger without noise. He met Amara Vale that afternoon. She didn't fit the frightened administrator Shindo's file had prepared him to meet. She was 35 and tall, dressed in a dark suit beneath a plain coat. She had no visible security and made no attempt to create authority through appearance. She met him in a consultation room rather than her office. That was the first thing he disliked. It denied him information. No family photographs, no personal files, no indication of what she valued enough to threaten. You know why I'm here, Ryo said. I know who sent you. Then this can be brief. It already is. She remained standing. Ryo placed his card on the table. There was no company logo, only his name and a number. The property in your possession belongs to Kagetsu Holdings. Amara looked at the card but did not touch it. That's what they told you. Return it. No. The answer arrived without performance. Ryo watched her for a moment. Most people facing him tried to explain themselves. They filled silence because they mistook explanation for protection. Amara did neither. You know what happens when an organization like ours loses sensitive material. Yes, you understand that keeping it creates liability for this foundation. Yes. That changed the calculations slightly. Ryo left without repeating himself. By 6 that evening, one of Hoshin House's primary medical distributors suspended deliveries pending a contractual review. By the following morning, a payment processor flagged 2 incoming transfers. Before noon, the company managing part of Hoshin's property portfolio requested documentation normally reviewed only during lease renewal. Ryo had chosen pressure instead of force because pressure was cleaner. 3 simultaneous disruptions created fear. Fear created urgency. Urgency created mistakes. At 8 the next morning, he received an update. Hoshin House had moved pharmaceutical orders through a partner clinic in Kawasaki. The suspended transfers had been replaced by a reserve fund held through a dormant charitable partnership. The property request had been answered with complete compliance documentation before the landlord's attorneys could draft a second notice. Ryo read the report twice. Then he drove back to Hoshin House. Amara was speaking with a pharmacist when he entered. She finished the conversation before acknowledging him. You moved quickly, Ryo said. You were predictable. That irritated him more than defiance would have. You think surviving 48 hours means you've won something. I think it means you assumed I wouldn't understand what you were doing. She led him into the same consultation room. This time, a dark leather ledger sat on the table. Ryo stopped before reaching the chair. There it was. No guards. No safe. No elaborate leverage. Amara had placed the object he had been searching for directly between them. You could have given it back yesterday. I could have. Why didn't you? Because you still think this is about stolen property. Ryo reached for the book. Amara placed 2 fingers on its cover, not enough to physically stop him. Enough to make the gesture a choice. Take it, she said, and you may never learn why your name is inside. His hand remained where it was. For the first time since entering the building, Amara had his full attention. What name yours? She opened the ledger. Several pages contained typed transaction entries, but handwritten marks filled the margins. Ryo recognized financial codes, dates, account references. The other markings were unfamiliar. Abbreviations, short annotations beside names. He had seen enough criminal accounting to know they did not belong there. What are those? Amara ignored the question and turned several pages. She stopped at a transaction dated 15 years earlier. Ryo read the date before anything else. April 17th. He had been 19. The surgery had taken place shortly after midnight. His stomach did not drop. His breathing did not change. He simply read, more carefully. The recipient code matched the hospital. The patient reference was partly redacted. The amount was close to what he remembered being told Kagetsu had paid. But the originating account was wrong. Hoshin Medical Relief Trust, he read. Predecessor organization, Amara said. Kagetsu could have funded the trust. They didn't. You know that she turned the ledger slightly toward him and pointed to the reimbursement column. Empty. Ryo looked again. That proves nothing. No. This does. She indicated a later entry several lines below. The same amount had been copied into a Kagetsu internal account weeks afterward. Not as reimbursement, as assistance issued. Ryo knew the terminology. He had seen it in recruitment files. Housing paid, medical expense covered, debt assumed, assistance issued. The language used when Kagetsu wanted someone to remember what had been done for them. This could be falsified, he said. It could. Her agreement made him look at her. You're not going to argue. I don't need you convinced yet. Yet Amara closed the ledger halfway. Ryo noticed then that she had been watching him differently since he mentioned the surgery date. Not triumph, recognition. He remembered the photograph hanging in the corridor outside the room. An older Japanese man beside several patients, a teenage boy, partly hidden at the edge of the image. Ryo had barely looked at it when he entered. Now he remembered the hospital jacket. He turned back to Amara. How do you know the date? For the first time, she paused before answering. I know more about that payment than you do. That isn't an answer. No, he should have taken the ledger. That had been the assignment. Instead, he asked, who stole it? Amara's expression changed by less than a degree, but enough to tell him the question was wrong. No one stole it from you. She opened the book again and turned to another page. This one carried a number Ryo recognized immediately. His old hospital case number. He had not seen it in years. The question, she said, is why someone spent 15 years making you believe it belonged to them. Ryo stared at the number. Until that moment, he had entered Hoshin House, believing the problem was a woman refusing to return Kagetsu property. Now, the ledger in front of him suggested something far more dangerous. The debt that had defined his adult life might never have been Kagetsu's to collect. Ryo did not touch the ledger again. He asked Amara for a copy of the page instead. She refused. That would be easier for you to remove. For me. For whoever sent you. He looked at her across the table. You still think I'm here only because Shindo told me to come. I think you were. That distinction mattered. Ryo took out his phone and photographed nothing. He simply checked the time. I need to verify the account. You can't from your normal system. You sound certain. I am. Why Amara closed the ledger? That answer costs more than you've paid for. He almost smiled but stopped himself. The irritation was still there. So was something more useful now, curiosity. That decision became expensive within 4 hours. Shindo called him back to Kagetsu Holdings just after 6. The chairman remained behind his desk while Ryo stood near the windows. You found the building. Yes. The director, yes. And she may be a receiver, not the source. Shindo studied him for a moment. Maybe I don't have enough yet. You normally do. Ryo said nothing. Shindo opened a file on his tablet. I'm told one of Hoshin's suppliers resumed deliveries. Ryo had expected that. I released the hold. Why? The pressure was becoming visible. Too many disruptions at once would create questions outside the Foundation. It was a defensible answer, not a complete one. Shindo tapped the screen once. You're becoming cautious over a charity administrator. I'm becoming cautious over a missing ledger. Shindo accepted that on the surface. Then he asked, Did you see the handwritten sections? Ryo answered too slowly. Some. Shindo's fingers stopped over the tablet. What did they look like? Old notation. Financial, possibly. Shindo leaned back. The physical book comes back intact. No copies, no torn pages, no photographs. You've said that. I'm saying it again. Ryo left with one new fact. Shindo cared less about the ledger's location than about its physical condition. That did not fit the explanation he had been given. If the book merely contained dangerous financial records, destruction should have solved the problem. That would have matched recovery inefficiency. Instead, Shindo wanted the original. Ryo returned to Hoshin House the next morning. Amara was in a meeting with a volunteer accountant. He waited in the corridor. The old photograph he had noticed before was gone. In its place hung a framed certificate from a donor organization. When Amara emerged, he pointed at the empty section of wall. You moved it. She followed his gaze. The photograph. I move things occasionally. Yesterday it was there. Yes. Today it isn't. Yes. He let the repetition end. You knew my surgery date before I told you. I knew the year. No. You reacted to the date. She did not deny it. That was the first time he believed she might actually be protecting something rather than merely withholding leverage. They went into her office this time. It was practical and crowded with binders. Ryo noticed she had chosen to let him see the room now, a minor concession, or a calculated one. You want access to the ledger again? She said. I want to know who brought it here. No one brought it here. That's not what I asked. Amara opened a laptop. 3 weeks ago, Hoshin received a notice that archival property connected to one of our predecessor trusts had been released after a corporate restructuring from Kagetsu indirectly. She showed him a sequence of digital transfer records. The documents had moved through a legal storage firm, then into Hoshin's archival custody. The metadata mattered more than the route. One authorization token originated from a Kagetsu internal administrative server. Ryo recognized the prefix. Someone inside the organization had approved the release. He looked at her. So, you didn't steal it? No. Why didn't you say that yesterday? Because you wouldn't have believed me. He could not argue. Yesterday, he would have assumed the documents were fabricated. Now he knew enough about the internal token format to know they were real. The first question had been answered. Amara had not taken the ledger. The next one was worse. Who inside Kagetsu released it, I don't know. Convenient. For both of us. Ryo read the transfer chain again. If someone inside Kagetsu had intentionally allowed the book to reach Hoshin House, then Amara might not be the target. She might be the destination. He looked toward the locked cabinet beside her desk. The ledger. She unlocked it. This time she did not make him ask. They worked standing over the desk. They did not sit. Ryo traced modern account references, while Amara focused on the older entries. The strange abbreviations appeared repeatedly. They appeared beside medical expenses, housing grants, emergency loans. Those aren't accounting codes, she said. You said that before. I'm more certain now. Why? She pointed to 3 markings: post-operative notation, discharge classification, complication status. Ryo looked at her. You're a physician medical administration. Before that clinical training. That was another thing Shindo's file had reduced to a line. Amara pulled an old reference manual from a shelf. The abbreviations matched. Not perfectly. They were outdated, but close enough. Ryo turned more pages. The book had been organized to look financial. The handwritten margins kept following people rather than money. Successful recovery, transferred, long-term care, deceased, relocated, not profit categories. Patient outcomes. Who wrote these? He asked. Amara closed the reference manual. My stepfather used some of the same notation. There it was. Not the whole answer. A door opening a few centimeters. What was his name? Kenji Vale. What did he do? He helped establish the trust that existed before Hoshin House. Helped how financial structure, medical grants, legal protections. Ryo turned back to the ledger. You think he wrote this? I think he may have written parts of it. You knew that yesterday, too. I suspected it. Why keep that from me? Because you work for the organization. He spent years trying to understand. Understand, Trace? Amara moved away from the desk. He believed money intended for treatment and emergency relief was being redirected, relabeled, then credited to organizations that never funded the original assistance. Kagetsu, among others. Ryo read one entry again. The structure was simple once he knew what to look for. External trust payment, delayed internal Kagetsu entry, same recipient, same amount, different claim source. He turned several pages. The pattern repeated. Not every time. Enough. Kagetsu had not necessarily stolen the money itself. In some cases, it had stolen authorship of the rescue. That distinction was smaller legally than morally. Ryo knew what Kagetsu did with gratitude. He had lived it. He closed the ledger. How many people I don't know yet. You've been through the book. Not all of it. Why not? Because I was trying to determine whether reading it would make Hoshin safer or more exposed. That answer sounded cautious until Ryo understood what she meant. If the Foundation had received funds later claimed by Kagetsu Hoshin, itself could appear complicit. Your organization took their money. Possibly. And you kept operating. Yes. Knowing where it came from. Knowing where some of it appeared to come from. She looked directly at him. I'm not asking you to believe Hoshin is clean. It was the first thing she'd said that cost her. It would have been easier to present herself as an innocent civilian institution trapped by criminal finance. Instead, she admitted uncertainty. Ryo respected it despite himself. His phone vibrated. A logistics notice, one of Hoshin's previously frozen suppliers, had been restored fully. His authorization had gone through. Under it was another message from Kagetsu Security. Financial access review initiated. Shindo had noticed. Power had bought the clinic time. It had also left fingerprints. Amara saw enough on his screen to understand. You reversed the hold. Yes. That creates a problem for you. Yes. Why do it? Because the original pressure was based on a conclusion I no longer believe. It was not an apology. She did not treat it as one. She opened another file instead. This is what I didn't use yesterday. A list of internal Kagetsu reference numbers appeared beside Ryo's name. Several enforcement operations, enough to damage him publicly if released without context. You had this? Yes. You could have sent it to the press. And dragged patients, employees, and donors into a story they didn't choose. Ryo looked at the screen then, at her. For the first time, they were not negotiating from threat. They were measuring each other by what they had chosen not to do. That felt more dangerous. He pointed at the ledger. My surgery. Amara's attention changed. Kenji Vale knew about it. She did not answer. Ryo turned the pages until he found the original trust entry again. There was a small approval code beside it. Amara went still. He'd seen that code before. It was in one of the Hoshin Incorporation files. KV Ryo looked at her. Kenji approved the payment. Amara exhaled once. Yes. The room seemed smaller now, not because either moved closer, but because the distance between their histories had just disappeared. You knew. I found your case years ago. How much do you know? Not enough. Then tell me what you do know. Before she could answer, Ryo's phone vibrated again. This time, it was not a message. His authentication session had been terminated. He tried the Kagetsu financial portal. Access denied. Then, the archive. Denied. Then, internal personnel records. Denied. Shindo had begun cutting him out. Ryo put the phone down. Amara understood without asking. The ledger had already changed their relationship. Now, investigating it had changed his position inside Kagetsu. And somewhere inside the organization, someone had deliberately allowed this book to reach the one foundation connected to Kenji Vale. Ryo looked at Amara. From now on, you don't show this to anyone without telling me first. Her expression hardened. That sounds like an order. It isn't. What is it? A warning. To me, to both of us. For once, she did not argue. The missing ledger was no longer something between them. It had become the reason they were now standing on the same side. Neither of them yet understood the question. Ryo discovered the cost of being useful to Kagetsu before noon. His access card still opened the building. It no longer opened the floors that mattered. He stood in the private elevator lobby while the reader flashed red beneath his hand. He tried a second time out of habit, not hope. Behind the glass partition, 2 junior security officers pretended not to watch. One of them had worked under him for 4 years. Neither approached. Ryo turned away before the situation could become a test of loyalty. His phone still worked. His name still carried weight. That made the loss more complicated. Power rarely disappeared all at once. First it became conditional. Then visible. Then expensive. He called a regional logistics manager. He'd placed the man in that role 18 months earlier. Keep Hoshin's medical supplier open for 72 hours. There was a pause. I thought the hold was reinstated. It was, and Chairman Shindo. 72 hours. The man agreed. Ryo ended the call. He knew exactly what he had done. The supplier would remain open. The manager would now have to explain why he had obeyed an officer whose authority was under review. A favor that protected Hoshin had just implicated someone else. By the time Ryo reached the street, Shindo already knew. The message arrived without accusation. Return to headquarters. Ryo did not. He went to Hoshin House. Amara was in a conference room with 3 external accountants when he arrived. Boxes of financial records covered the table. She looked up once saw him and continued speaking. That told him more than greeting him would have. She had made a decision. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. When the others left, Ryo remained by the door. You invited auditors. Independent Compliance Council. You understand what happens if they find Kagetsu-linked money. Yes, they'll freeze accounts. They may. They could suspend your charitable status. They could. You're giving strangers access to every weakness this foundation has. Amara gathered the files into one stack. I'm giving them access before Shindo gives them his version. Ryo walked closer to the table. This isn't protection, it's exposure. It's both. You should have told me first. Her eyes lifted. No. The answer stopped him. You warned me not to show the ledger without telling you. I warned you because someone inside Kagetsu is manipulating its custody, and now you think that gives you approval rights over my foundation. I think you're moving before we know what the ledger proves. And I think waiting for perfect certainty is exactly how institutions get buried under somebody else's story. Their disagreement did not come from distrust anymore. That was the problem. They knew enough about each other to understand exactly where the other would push. Rio wanted to narrow exposure until he could identify the threat. Amara wanted to widen scrutiny until the threat could no longer control the narrative. Protection and control had begun using the same vocabulary. Rio looked at the boxes. If they ask whether you knowingly received Kagetsu money, I'll answer. And if the answer damages Hoshin, I'll answer anyway. He studied her for a moment. You'd burn your own expansion project for this. If the project depends on accounts, I can't defend. It isn't mine to save. The words stayed with him, not because they were noble, because she meant them. Rio had spent most of his adult life preserving structures first. He asked whether they deserved preservation later. Amara was prepared to lose structure rather than falsify its legitimacy. He disliked how much he respected that. His phone rang. This time Shindo did not bother with a message. Rio answered. You ignored an instruction, Shindo said. I'm working. No. You're deciding which instructions still deserve obedience. That sounds like an important distinction. There was a short pause. Then Shindo said, Come in. I'll return when I have something useful. You had something useful. The ledger. Rio looked at Amara. She did not pretend not to listen. Why do you need the original intact? The line went quiet. Then Shindo answered, Because copies can be altered. So can originals. You're becoming philosophical. I'm becoming specific. Shindo's tone changed only slightly. Rio, the organization paid for your life before you had anything worth offering in return. Don't confuse one charity director's questions with proof that your history was stolen. There it was. Not anger, ownership. Rio ended the call without permission. Amara watched him put the phone down. He still uses it. What? The surgery. Rio pulled out a chair but did not sit. He recruited me 2 years after it. You said he gave you work. He gave me a place. That isn't the same thing. It was then. He had never explained that part to anyone because it had never required explanation. Before Kagetsu, Rio had moved between temporary jobs and unpaid hospital balances. He slept in borrowed rooms. Relatives pulled back when helping became inconvenient. Then, men from Kagetsu arrived with paperwork. The form showed what the organization had paid. They had not demanded immediate repayment. That was what made it effective. They had given him time, work, status. A reason to believe survival had produced an obligation greater than money. If the payment was false, Amara said the place was still real. Rio looked at her. That's supposed to help number a good answer. She did not try to turn theft into healing. He sat finally. Kagetsu gave me something my family didn't. Belonging a structure that didn't pretend I was temporary. And if Shindo built that structure around a lie, Rio looked toward the closed door. Then I need to know how much of it falls when the lie does. That was not fear for himself. Amara understood. You're worried about the people beneath you. Some of them have families, legal jobs, businesses tied into Kagetsu companies. If this breaks badly, they don't all land somewhere clean. And that means the truth waits. No. Then what does it mean? It means truth has consequences, whether it's right or not. For the first time, she did not answer immediately. Their conflict had moved beyond whether Kagetsu had lied. Now, they were arguing about what responsibility came after truth. That was harder. Amara unlocked the ledger cabinet. She opened the book near the medical annotations. I found something. She placed an old clinical index beside it. 3 abbreviations matched precisely. Not accounting marks. Not shorthand that merely resembled medicine. Patient outcome classifications. Rio followed the handwritten entries line by line. Operative recovery, discharge, long-term monitoring. Then another mark beside a name several pages later. Relocated. This book follows patients. He said, Yes. Why would a financial ledger track outcomes? I don't think it began as a financial ledger, but the implication was enough. One of the assumptions holding the entire investigation together had begun to fail. Ryo turned back to his own entry. A short handwritten code sat beside his case number. He had seen the same form of lettering once before. On a legal trust authorization, Amara had shown him, K.V. Kenji Vale. Ryo leaned back. He wrote this. Possibly. You believe he did? I believe he touched this record. And the photograph Amara's expression closed. Not yet. He almost pushed. Instead, he stopped. That choice changed something between them more effectively than insisting would have. She noticed. Then she crossed to a locked cabinet and removed a narrow archival envelope. Inside was a duplicate of the photograph that had disappeared from the corridor. Kenji stood beside several recovering patients. At the edge, partly hidden behind another man, was a 19-year-old Ryo Kanzaki. He recognized the hospital jacket first, then himself. The face was thinner, the posture uncertain, the eyes unmistakable. He turned the photograph over. A case number had been written on the back. His. Below it, one line in English. Never let them turn survival into ownership. Ryo read it twice. Why didn't you show me this before? Because I didn't know whether you were the person he was warning about or the person he was warning. That answer hurt more than accusation would have. Before he could respond, Amara's office phone rang. She answered. Her expression changed as she listened. Not fear. Recognition of consequence. Send it to me. She opened her laptop. A message had gone out to several Hoshin donors and commercial partners. The language was careful. Questions regarding laundering exposure, unverified criminal financial relationships, pending internal evidence. Attached were partial account records showing Kagetsu-linked funds entering Hoshin. Another document named Ryo as the officer who had authorized transfers and supplier exceptions. The structure of the attack was immediately clear. Shindo was not trying to retrieve the ledger quietly anymore. He was building a version of events in which Hoshin had taken criminal money and Ryo had helped direct it. Amara would become the corrupt civilian operator. Ryo would become the rogue enforcer. Kagetsu would become the institution betrayed by both. Ryo stood. This is coordinated, I know. My name gives it credibility, and Hoshin's accounts give it evidence. Their choices to protect one another were now weapons in someone else's hands. Ryo's intervention with the suppliers. Amara's financial exposure, their shared access to the ledger. Everything that proved cooperation could be reframed as conspiracy. Amara closed the laptop. We can't keep investigating quietly. Ryo looked at the photograph again, then at Kenji's sentence. No. The strategy that had protected them until now was finished. Something they had chosen to preserve. Hoshin the ledger, each other's access to the truth, had become the mechanism Shindo intended to use to destroy both of them. The first public consequence arrived before either of them had decided what to do with Kenji Vale's warning. Hoshin House lost one of its largest donors before noon. The notice was polite. The Foundation's current financial exposure had become incompatible with the donor's compliance standards. Future support would be reconsidered after independent review. Amara read the email once and forwarded it to counsel. Ryo watched from the other side of her office. That's the first, he said. It won't be the last. It doesn't have to become worse. She looked up. What are you proposing I can still reach people inside Kagetsu? That's exactly what Shindo is counting on. Ryo understood her point. Every private intervention he made now could be presented as further proof that he had used syndicate influence to protect Hoshin. His old methods had become contaminated. Amara turned the laptop toward him. Her auditors had finished a preliminary separation of Hoshin's accounts. 3 categories filled the screen. Clean funds, unverified funds, funds routed through entities later connected to Kagetsu. The 3rd category was larger than either of them wanted. If Shindo releases partial records, she said he can make all 3 look the same. And if you release everything, Hoshin loses access to the 3rd category immediately. Possibly some of the 2nd. How much enough to kill the expansion project? Ryo looked at the numbers. Months earlier, that project would have sounded abstract to him. Now he knew what it represented. A second treatment floor, additional migrant medicine capacity, 2 specialist programs, the future Amara had spent years building. You're prepared to lose it. I'm prepared not to defend money I can't verify. Rio nodded once. Then he reached for the ledger. They had stopped treating it like contraband. That was the first sign the crisis had changed. Amara opened Kenji's old clinical index beside it. Rio spread copies of Kagetsu's modern account summaries across the table. The handwritten abbreviations matched Kenji's system so consistently they couldn't be dismissed. Post-operative progress, housing stabilization, employment placement, long-term follow-up. Rio tapped one entry. Why is employment in a medical record? Amara leaned closer. It shouldn't be. She turned several pages. The handwritten entries followed recipients long after medical assistance ended. A person received surgery, then housing, then employment, then months or years later, a Kagetsu account listed an equivalent amount as organizational support. Rio began seeing the architecture, not one transaction, a process. Amara saw it too. This wasn't built to track money, she said. It tracked people. Yes. Rio stared at his own case number. The answer had been in front of them since the beginning. They had only kept asking the wrong question. Amara opened Kenji's archive box and removed the trust documents she had previously withheld. Not a new secret. It was the other half already visible. The original trust rules required patient assistance records to retain independent provenance. Any later organization claiming reimbursement or sponsorship had to preserve the original funding source. Kenji had designed the ledger to enforce that distinction. He created it, Rio said. Amara did not answer immediately. Then she nodded. The structure is his. The twist was not that Kenji had found a Kagetsu ledger. He had built the record himself. Rio turned to the handwritten columns again. That changed everything. The clinical abbreviations were not strange additions to criminal accounting. They were the original purpose of the book. The later Kagetsu entries had been layered over them. The organization had not merely hidden dirty money inside a medical record. It had converted humanitarian assistance into claims of ownership. Rio sat back. Shindo needed the physical copy because of the handwriting. Yes. Copies of the typed entries could be called altered, but the original sequence shows Kenji's notes came first, and the Kagetsu claims came later. Amara looked at him. That's why he asked whether you'd seen the handwritten sections. The earlier conversation replayed in Rio's mind with different meaning. Shindo had never been protecting ordinary financial secrecy. He had been protecting chronology. Rio picked up the old photograph again. Kenji stood by patience. He was the 19-year-old version at the edge. His own case number was on the back. This wasn't only my payment. No. How many people? Amara opened another section of the ledger. Enough names appeared that neither tried to count them. The pattern was what mattered. Outside trust funds paid for treatment, emergency housing, rehabilitation, relocation. Later, Kagetsu records recast those acts as syndicate generosity. In some cases, the recipients subsequently entered businesses' security operations or patronage networks tied to Kagetsu. Rio recognized names, not just low-level men, senior figures, people whose loyalty to the organization was legendary, people who told stories about what Kagetsu had done for them when nobody else would. Shindo had not invented loyalty from nothing. He had taken real moments of rescue and rewritten the identity of the rescuer. That was more effective. People defended gratitude harder than fear. Rio looked at Amara. You knew my case was in Kenji's files. Yes, you didn't know this was the mechanism. No. That distinction mattered. It kept the revelation honest. No one had been sitting on the whole truth. They had assembled it from what had already existed. Amara closed the ledger. If we release this publicly now, Shindo says it's fabricated. He'll also say you built it, and that you helped me. Rio stood. Then, we don't start with the public. Amara studied him. What are you thinking? People inside Kagetsu can verify their own histories. That assumes they want to. They don't have to trust me. He pointed to the original trust references. They only have to make one phone call. This was the part Amara could not do. She had names and records. Rio knew which names could destabilize the structure without creating immediate chaos. He knew who had influence because of fear, who had it because of money, and who had it because everyone believed Kagetsu had once saved them. He began with 3. Not the loudest men, the ones whose loyalty stories had become institutional folklore. Rio did not threaten them. He sent each man a trust reference payment date and original funding entity. Then, one sentence. Verify who paid. The first response came within an hour. A call. Rio answered on speaker only after Amara agreed. The man on the other end sounded more confused than angry. The hospital says the account wasn't Kagetsu. Rio said, I know. Then who paid the original trust record is in front of me. Silence followed. Then, who else knows? That depends on what you do next. Rio ended the call. By late afternoon, 2 more men had verified their histories. That was enough. Questions moved through Kagetsu faster than any formal order. Shindo called twice. Rio ignored both. Then Amara's counsel arrived with the second half of their strategy. The independent review had progressed far enough. Hoshin could voluntarily freeze the contaminated accounts before external authorities did it for them. The cost was severe. The expansion was finished. Several contracts would collapse, but the Foundation's clean accounts could be separated legally. Amara signed the authorization herself. Rio watched her do it. You're giving up years of work. I'm keeping the part I can defend. Her hand did not hesitate over the signature. That decision changed the crisis more than any threat could have. Shindo's narrative depended on Hoshin, fighting to retain suspicious money. Instead, Amara surrendered what she could not justify before he could frame the loss as confiscation. By evening, Kagetsu's internal leadership meeting had turned against Shindo. Rio did not attend. He sent the ledger references instead. The men inside the room could verify them independently. That was the point. Shindo could argue with Rio. He could discredit Amara. He could not erase hospital records, trust disbursements, and old legal filings that matched Kenji's handwritten chronology. When Shindo finally called again, Rio answered. You have no idea what you're breaking. Shindo said, I know exactly what I'm breaking. Men need reasons to remain loyal. Then give them true ones. You think truth runs an organization. Number Rio looked at the ledger, but lies eventually stop. He ended the call. By nightfall, Shindo had not been arrested, dragged away, or publicly destroyed. Something more damaging had happened. His explanation had stopped working. Senior Kagetsu members began demanding access to their own historical records. 2 financial directors resigned from his committee. A third refused an order to seize Hoshin assets. The structure had not vanished. It had lost the belief that made obedience automatic. Rio understood what that meant for him, too. There would be no clean return to his old position after this. Amara's auditors had preserved Hoshin's legal core, but the Foundation would survive, diminished. They had won by sacrificing the very systems that once gave them leverage. Near midnight, they stood alone in the archive room. The ledger rested between them. For the first time since they met, neither needed anything from the other to survive the next hour. That made the distance between them feel more honest. Amara looked at him. You could still go back. Rio knew what she meant. Shindo was weakened. The hierarchy was open. A man with Ryo's reputation could use the fracture and rise higher than before. He closed the ledger. So could you. She glanced toward the compliance files. No, neither of them could. Not really. The truth had cost too much to become temporary. And now that the central threat had been broken, one question remained without an enemy to answer it for them. Whether they still chose each other once neither of them needed protection from the same lie. The first thing Rio lost was his office, not his title. That took another week. The office disappeared first. By Monday morning, the nameplate outside the room on the 23rd floor had been removed. His files were transferred into legal review. His remaining authority was reduced to temporary consultation, while Kagetsu's leadership argued over what could still be saved. No one asked him to return his access card. It simply stopped working. He stood outside the building once. He looked up at the floor where Shindo had first sent him after the ledger, then walked away. Inside, Kagetsu Masato Shindo remained alive, uninjured, and increasingly irrelevant. That was worse for a man like him. The internal committee verified enough of Kenji Vale's records to make denial impossible. He was removed from financial control. Several senior figures who had once defended him refused further instructions. Others stayed loyal to the organization, but no longer to the mythology he had built around it. Shindo's argument had been that stability justified the deception. Once the deception was out in the open, stability itself was negotiable. He did not go to prison that week. He did not vanish. He lost the right to decide what others owed. For Ryo, that felt like the more accurate punishment. Hoshin House paid differently. The expansion project died quietly. Contractors were released. A lease on the neighboring floor was surrendered. 2 donors withdrew permanently. 3 accounts connected to contaminated Kagetsu routing were frozen, reviewed, then relinquished rather than defended. Amara signed every document herself. There was no triumph in it. She had spent years building toward a larger clinic. Now she walked through rooms that would never become treatment space. Ryo found her there one evening after the contractors had removed the final equipment. The floor smelled of plaster and dust. "You should be downstairs," he said. "So should you. I don't work here." Exactly. He looked around. This was the new ward would have been. She did not sound bitter. It made the loss land harder. "Do you regret opening the ledger?" "No." "Do you regret keeping it?" Amara considered that. "Sometimes." It was the first answer she gave him that sounded tired rather than strategic. Ryo leaned against the unfinished doorway. "I could replace the money." She looked at him. He continued before she misunderstood. "Not through Kagetsu. I still control legitimate holdings outside the disputed structure." "Enough to cover what you lost?" "No." The refusal came too quickly. He straightened. "You haven't heard the terms. I don't need to. There are no terms." "That's what people say when the terms haven't appeared yet." He almost argued, then stopped. She was right in a way that mattered beyond money. The entire story between them had begun with a debt disguised as generosity. Ryo had spent half his life confusing assistance with ownership. Now he was offering protection through the same mechanism, even if his intention was different. Amara stepped closer, not enough to make the moment soft. "Don't save Hoshin. I wasn't trying to own it. I know. That should matter." "It does." She looked toward the empty floor, but intention doesn't erase structure. That stayed with him. Weeks later, Hoshin reopened its accounts under stricter oversight. Smaller, cleaner, more exposed. Every major source of funding was disclosed publicly. The foundation lost prestige and gained something Amara valued more. No one could quietly rewrite who had paid for what. Kenji Vale's archive was transferred into protected institutional custody. The original ledger remained part of the record. Ryo requested one correction: his own medical file. For 15 years, the account had listed Kagetsu Assistance as the source of his surgery payment. The entry was amended. The original trust appeared instead. Hoshin Medical Relief Trust, approved under Kenji Vale. Ryo stared at the corrected copy for a long time. The numbers had changed less than the sentence around them. The money was the same. The life it had purchased was the same. Only ownership had been removed. Amara found him in the archive room. "You got the correction?" "Yes." "Feel different?" "No." She nodded. That answer seemed to satisfy her. The past had not become easier because the record became accurate. That was another thing they no longer pretended. By then, Kagetsu had begun reorganizing. Several legitimate businesses were sold. The charitable network was dismantled. A smaller leadership council replaced Shindo's financial committee. Ryo was offered a place in the new structure, not at the bottom, near the top. The invitation arrived through a man who had once reported to him. "You could stabilize it," the man said. Ryo understood what that meant. Men still trusted his judgment. His name still carried authority. If he returned, he could shape what Kagetsu became next. For several hours, he let himself consider it. Not because he missed power, because power still offered the illusion that damage could be controlled if the correct person held enough of it. Then he remembered the unfinished Hoshin floor. He declined. No speech, no accusation, just no. 3 days later, he met Amara in her office. The room looked different. Fewer binders, more transparent storage. The old photograph of Kenji had returned to the wall. The teenage patient was still partly obscured at the edge. Ryo noticed it immediately. "You put it back." "Yes. You planning to move it again in Nai?" She handed him a folder. Inside was a contract. External risk and security advisor. Fixed term, fixed salary. No ownership interest, no authority over medical operations. Full conflict disclosure, independent oversight. Ryo read it twice. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you boundaries." That sounds less flattering. It's supposed to. He looked at the signature line. No hidden authority. No. No private control over funding. No. No ability to make decisions for you. Definitely no. He looked up. "And if I disagree, you can say so. And if you ignore me, I probably will sometimes." For the first time in weeks, Ryo smiled briefly. Small, real. He signed. That was their choice. Not dependence, not rescue, not repayment. A structure neither of them had to lie about. Months later, Hoshin held a modest donor meeting in a room half the size of the one Amara had once planned. Ryo sat near the back. No guards, no men waiting outside, no private entrance. Amara stood at the front presenting financial disclosures that would have terrified her a year earlier. Every major donor listed, every disputed account explained, every limitation visible. When the meeting ended, people left slowly. Ryo remained. Amara joined him by the old photograph. For a while, neither spoke. Then he looked at the archival case beneath it. The ledger stays yes. Even after everything. Especially after everything. Why? Because memory turns dangerous when only powerful people are trusted to edit it. Ryo placed one hand on the glass case. Amara placed hers beside his. Not over it, beside it. That difference mattered. For most of his life, protection had meant controlling enough of the world. Nothing important could be taken from him. Now he understood another version. To protect something without claiming it. To stay without demanding ownership. To be chosen without creating debt. Trust begins where ownership ends. Subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what you think really changed them.